So, today I want to revisit the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. About a week ago, a flood of the Pearl River, in combination with overtaxed and damaged infrastructure, led to the O.B. Curtis water treatment plant shutting down, which in turn created a scenario where approximately 160,000 people in Jackson, Mississippi had little to no water coming out of their faucets. Additionally, many stores quickly ran out of supplies of bottled water as people quickly bought them up. While this is certainly horrific, since then, federal assistance has been brought in. Water bottles have been distributed across the city, and as of right now, the water treatment plant has been turned back on. Meanwhile, water is now flowing through the pipes and most homes of Jackson, Mississippi again. So while this has been a gross oversimplification of what's happened this past week, the question remains, why am I covering this? Because truth be told, this is only a microcosm of the actual full effects of water crisis that have been affecting Jackson, Mississippi for decades. And this current federal solution of bringing in water bottles is only a band-aid solution that isn't even remotely enough to begin to address this actual water crisis that has affected the people of Jackson. The truth is, this is an all too common occurrence to the people of Jackson. People go without drinkable water for months at a time at an alarming rate. Boil water notices happen all the time. And as of 2016, lead was discovered in the water, leading to notices asking children under 5 to not drink the tap water. In 2020, the EPA determined that the water of Jackson failed an inspection because the water could potentially be host to bacteria and parasites. Water main breaks are a frequent occurrence, leaving entire sections of the city with no water. The citizens of Jackson use familiar tactics of pre-filling buckets of water and tubs in case of a crisis, and often have plans to go visit neighbors across town when water systems fail locally, just so that they can shower and go about their lives. The 100-year-old piping under the city failed during the exact same winter storm that took out the Texas power grid in 2021, something that I actually covered on this channel. If you want to see more details on that, definitely check the video in the description down below. But meanwhile, the water treatment facility in question this past week had damaged water pumps as early as July and kept running on backups until they failed. And all the while, a boil water notice has been in effect since July. There continues to still be a boil water notice in Jackson, even with the water flowing through the pipes right now. And chances are, the next disaster that's probably only weeks, if not months away, is going to lead to more boil water notices and more situations where water is not flowing through the homes of the people of Jackson. So the actual water crisis is not this one isolated incident, but the continued injustice that residents of Jackson experience, largely due to the intersection of racism, classism, and the abuse of power from state hierarchy. Both in the history of the United States and Mississippi, one's class and race have always been a huge determining factor in how, often, and of what quality infrastructure was available. This has been an issue from the beginning. And while I could discuss the profound effects caused by lack of infrastructure from the times of the institution of slavery to separate but supposedly equal facilities, for the sake of brevity, I believe the modern story of Jackson is best told at the moment of white flight. As school systems were integrated in Jackson, white families determined to keep their children segregated sought a combination of private education and moving to the suburbs north and west of Jackson in order to avoid integration. Now we have here an article from the Jackson Free Press that actually talks about this incident. The private school enrollment shot out overnight after forced integration. The majority of white students who left never returned or brought back future generations. In 1969, over 39,000 students attended public schools in Jackson, and the very next year, enrollment dropped to 30,713 students. Historic enrollment records show this to be fact, that nearly 9,000 white students pulled out almost immediately after the Supreme Court's decision. And this was the start of the process. After that, a lot of people who were white decided to flee the area, like I mentioned before, and go into the suburbs as quickly as possible to avoid integration. Now, when the white people fled, they took a large portion of the tax revenue of Jackson with them. So funding that would have gone to infrastructure in Jackson now went to the infrastructure of the suburbs. This whole process of white flight has transformed Jackson into a city with a 82% Black population, with approximately 26% of the population in poverty. Jackson, of course, has had to deal with all of these water crises that I've mentioned previously. However, the conveniently segregated white suburbs have not really had to deal with any of this. When the 2021 storm happened, they didn't have any issues. In general, in the suburbs, the water stays on for them and remains clean and fresh. Now, given that so much of the funding has left, slowly but surely, patchwork responses or lack of response over the past 50 years has exacerbated the problem. Without proper funding, more bandaid and smaller solutions have been used over time. Many residents cannot actually remember not boiling their water on a consistent basis, or having rust-colored water dripping from their faucets. That said, as with many other cases of local infrastructure, one of the solutions that was presented to fix everything was to privatize everything. And in 2013, as a potential solution, this privatization by a company miserably failed and ended up leading to worse outcomes. So we have here that in the city of Jackson in 2013, they entered a $90 million performance contract with Siemens, a German-based company, to upgrade Jackson's sewer lines and water treatment plants, and to install a new automated water sewer billing system. Court records show that in the months leading up to the contract, Siemens had promised $120 million in guaranteed savings for the city. The corporation stated that the new water sewer repairs and billing system alone would generate enough savings to pay for the $90 million project. Instead of generating revenue or saving the city money, the work Siemens contracted to complete resulted in problems that have thrown Jackson's water sewer system into crisis and the city further into debt. The lawsuit has charged. Now, this is a lawsuit that the city brought against Siemens, and they actually won, securing about $89 million back. But the damage was already done. Not long after Siemens and its subcontractors installed the new billing system, residents reported not receiving any bills, sometimes for months or years. Those who did receive water bills reported inaccurate and unusually high amounts, which they often did not pay. The fact remains that whenever you have a for-profit company being put in charge of repairing or maintaining vital resources like water, they will always extract wealth, not provide it. There is simply no incentive for them to not do the absolute minimum in terms of repairs in order to maximize their profits, and this will always lead to worse outcomes, because using very cheap repairs leads to more damage later on, and the company will then not want to have to pay for it and will rely on the city anyway. This happens all the time, and it's just this part of this neoliberal understanding of how we're supposed to fix things that, we constantly are trying to use privatization as a tool when it flat out does not work on things like water and other important necessities of life. But this does bring us to another issue. According to the mayor of Jackson, the repairs that are really necessary to completely overhaul Jackson's water system is estimated to be at least in the range of $1 billion. Some estimates have said even $2 to $4 billion, but let's go with that $1 billion figure for now. We also know that the money paid into the water system is the money that's being used to pay for its repair and upkeep. Anytime you pay your water bill, that money is supposed to go to repair and upkeep of the system to make sure that you maintain and keep water. That said, because of the issues tied to Siemens, citizens of Jackson were collectively on the hook for over $43 million in leftover bills, some of which could not be paid for due to poverty, but many of which was inaccurately charged in the first place, as I previously mentioned. Further, many people over the course of the past years have continued to pay into this water system that's actually not been providing them any water. especially as people have had to pay for bottled water or water jugs in order to have safe drinking water. Some of the individual bills, and I'm talking monthly individual bills, have been well over $100 for people not getting any water from their tap. Now, the reason I highlight all this is because the $43 million, no matter how you try to put it, isn't going to fix this billion-dollar problem. It's not going to solve the infrastructure issue that is at the core of Jackson, Mississippi's issues. But Mississippi's governor is actually more fixated on this $43 million and making sure that the people of Jackson pay every cent, rather than providing any sort of financial relief to the city. Now we have here that the governor wrote, "Other cities have issues too. Why should Jackson get a carve-out?" It's a bill, this is in reference to a bill that the Jackson mayor had tried to push for in order to sort out the outstanding water bills. And, it was promptly shot down by the governor in all of this. He states, it allows politicians to say that individuals are not responsible for paying their water bill. It's supposed to be for the impoverished or needy, but there are no safeguards in place to make sure that's the case. It's totally up to them. I'm very concerned about the free money concept that's been taking over politics today, the governor had said. Meanwhile, in the same time, around the time that the storm happened in 2021, he says, "I do think it's really important that the city of Jackson start collecting their water bill payments before they start going and asking everyone else to pony up more money." This is after a winter storm caused massive water main breaks and disasters across the city of Jackson. This was the governor's response to all of that. Meanwhile, the city has appealed for funds multiple times and has gotten practically nothing. In fact, when this winter storm happened, they got only a fraction of what they asked for. The city asked for $47 million ahead of the crisis and only got $3 million. This is nowhere near that billion-dollar mark that we need to see happen in order for Jackson to keep its water on and to continue to keep residents in a safe fashion. But they've never been in a safe fashion, not for 50 years. And clearly, this governor is refusing to provide proper funding to the city. And, one can only imagine why, when there's a white Republican governor, that they're refusing to provide funding to a majority black city in Mississippi while complaining about handing out free money and how people of Jackson need to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. It's racism. The answer is racism. And unfortunately, as long as there's a white Republican in charge of the state of Mississippi and in control of this majority black city, we're going to continue to see this happen over and over again. And, this begs the question, of course, of how the federal infrastructure money that was passed in 2021 is going to get allocated. As Mississippi has over $429 million over the next 5 years that it is allowed to spend on water lines and pipes. Now, more than likely, none of this, or practically none of this, is actually going to make it into Jackson's hands. And time will only tell how that free money is being distributed as Jackson gets fractions of what it actually needs. Chances are this money is going to end up in the hands of the suburbs who don't need it and would otherwise squander it or use it for any sort of other silly purpose, including going into the pockets of politicians themselves. Money won't be an issue when white people get it. But when Jackson needs it so that people can actually drink safe, healthy water, that's a problem. That's apparently a problem for this governor. Now, as a reminder, I do need to mention that this is the same state government, although a different governor, that thought it was appropriate to use millions of dollars in welfare funds to pay for several athletes and a volleyball facility and these athletes were supposedly contracted to make speeches like Brett Favre. And in fact, he never made the speech, but he was paid over $1 million at one time out of welfare money. Finally, with all of this, there's another concern that needs to be taken into account, and one that's been kind of creeping up in a lot of cities, just like Jackson. There's a lot of federal relief on the ground in Jackson right now, and a lot of media is covering what's going on in Jackson. The question is whether or not developers will now see this and see the crisis that's happening there and see the cheap prices of downtown Jackson and start to try to gentrify it in the near future, leaving current residents further unable to afford escalating prices until they're eventually pushed out of their homes and Jackson no longer looks like the city that it is now. This is a real fear that needs to be addressed in the coming years so that the people of Jackson now remain the people of Jackson if and ever when infrastructure is ever repaired. The fact remains that the actual water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi is a crisis of a combination of factors. It's a crisis of systemic racism and white supremacy. It's a crisis of capitalism and privatization. It's a crisis of state hierarchy and the abuse of power that offers. And it's a crisis of climate that will only get worse in time as rivers flood, as temperatures get hotter, and as water is all the more a necessity over time. And while we recognize this, it's important to remember that right now, there are still people without clean drinking water in Jackson, being told to close their eyes and mouths while they shower in rust-colored water. And while we have the tools to fix this today, we choose not to. The decision to refuse people clean drinking water is a choice, and it's a systemic choice that is perpetuated under our current system. There is a better way. We can do better. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord, where we have conversations on topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often become demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you so much for watching.